Well, welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is March 26, 2023, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's an honor to be joined by members of the Toronto, Calgary, and Chicago Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. To contribute your thoughts, please use the Raise Hands feature in Zoom. To keep the discussion flowing and ensure everyone has a chance to speak, I'll call on you in the order that hands are raised, using first names only. I've suggested 3 themes and excerpts from today's reading from 348D to the end of Plato's Protagoras, and these are posted on the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. We can focus on these or any of the other themes, and for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. As we exchange thoughts on today's reading, I'll briefly summarize and try to connect different perspectives to a common thread. After we finish recording in 2 hours, I welcome anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. Today's readings from the Protagoras begin with a discussion of courage, which Protagoras and many others to this day perceive to be part of virtue. Here, Socrates places courage in the context of confidence, and he and Protagoras proceed to examine the origin of confidence in the courageous compared to those we hold to be their opposites, namely cowards. They wind up agreeing that courage hinges not on some power of its own, but on knowledge of cause and effect in time, which leaves the place of courage in any definition of virtue very much in question. In driving to answer the fundamental question of this dialogue, which is whether virtue is teachable, Socrates then digresses. Starting with the question of confidence in one's actions to be measured as courageous or not, he then explores the distinction between pleasure and pain which the courageous and cowards experience. Following the thread of Socrates' logic is admittedly difficult, but maybe there's a point in his convolutions that relates to the long-windedness of Protagoras and his own repeated request for brevity. As the thread of logic becomes stretched and extended, any student of a sophist or philosopher will require use of recollection to relate more distant but nevertheless connected points in a dialectic seeking first principles of a thing such as virtue. So after several turns of logic, Socrates arrives at a fundamental conclusion that what motivates any human soul is a quest for the good and avoidance of the bad. By investigating what Protagoras holds to be the attributes of virtue, and particularly courage, Socrates concludes that it is not virtue that saves us from the bad, but instead that knowledge of the difference between good and bad is our salvation. The implication seems to be that we can go toward, but never fully know or achieve, the good. As Socrates described it in the Republic, the form of the good is accessible only to our faculty of reason. The form of the good, he said, is that which gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower, so that as a first principle of knowledge, the good therefore itself is unknowable. To seek the good, our remaining option then is to weigh our perceptions and expectations of possible actions to judge the probable outcomes. In a universe of uncertainty, at the core of which is the good of knowledge, the human task is to navigate probability with the best possible knowledge, while avoiding what Socrates called earlier in the dialogue, quote, the tyranny of convention, unquote. At the end, Socrates finds no universal form of virtue, but concludes that what we call virtue is actually a construct of knowledge. It is therefore knowledge, not virtue, that is teachable. In opposition to Socrates' view, Protagoras seems ultimately to say that virtue is a universal construct of 5 forms that somehow fit together with the first principle, although he is unable to demonstrate their differences or common connections. So I thought we could begin our dialogue today with a focus on courage. I'll start with the outset of the discussion between Socrates and Protagoras, when at 349D, Protagoras observes that the courageous sometimes do not display any of the other virtues. Then, without digression, I thought we could move to the conclusion of the matter at 360D with the argument that courage is conditional on knowledge and therefore has no power of its own. So let me just put on the screen share here, and I will start the reading. So this reading, actually, I started this at 348E, so it's backtracking a little bit, but this is kind of the start of the discussion about courage. Socrates says, Protagoras, I said, I don't want you to think that my motive in talking with you is anything else than to take a good hard look at things that continually perplex me. I think that Homer said it all in the line, going in tandem, one perceives before the other. Human beings are simply more resourceful this way in action, speech, and thought. If someone has a private perception, he immediately starts going around and looking until he finds somebody he can show it to and have it corroborated. And there's a particular reason why I would rather talk with you than anyone else. I think you are the best qualified to investigate the sort of things that decent and respectable individuals ought to examine, and virtue especially. Who else but you? Not only do you consider yourself to be noble and good, but unlike others who are themselves decent, respectable individuals, yet unable to make others so, you are not only good yourself, but able to make others good as well. And you have so much self-confidence that instead of concealing this skill, as others do, you advertise it openly to the whole Greek world, calling yourself a sophist, highlighting yourself as a teacher of virtue, the first to have ever deemed it appropriate to charge a fee for this. How could I not solicit your help in a joint investigation of these questions? There is no way I could not. So right now, I want you to remind me of the questions I first asked, starting from the beginning. Then I want to proceed together to take a hard look at some of the other questions. I believe the first question was this: wisdom, temperance, courage, justice, and piety. Are these 5 names for the same thing, or is there underlying each of these names a unique thing, a thing with its own power or function, each one unlike any of the others? You said that they are not names for the same thing, that each of these names refers to a unique thing, and that all of these are parts of virtue, not unlike the parts of gold, which are similar to each other and to the whole of which they are parts, but like the parts of a face, dissimilar to the whole of which they are parts and to each other, and each one having its own unique power or function. If this is still your view, say so. If it's changed in any way, make your new position clear, for I am certainly not going to hold you accountable for what you said before if you want to say something at all different now. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you were just trying out something on me before. What I'm saying to you, Socrates, is that all these are parts of virtue, and that while 4 of them are reasonably close to each other, courage is completely different from all the rest. The proof that what I am saying is true is that you will find many people who are extremely unjust, impious, intemperate, and ignorant, and yet exceptionally courageous. Hold it right there, I said. This is worth looking into. Would you say courageous men are confident or something else? Confident, yes, and ready for action where most men would be afraid. Well then, do you agree that virtue is something fine and that you offer yourself as a teacher of it because it is fine? The finest thing of all, unless I'm quite out of my mind. Then is part of it worthless and part of it fine, or all of it fine? Surely it is all as fine as can be. Do you know who dives confidently into wells? Of course, divers. Is this because they know what they are doing, or for some other reason? Because they know what they are doing. Who are confident in fighting from horseback, riders or non-riders? Riders. And in fighting with shields, shieldmen or non-shieldmen? Shieldmen, and so on down the line, if that's what you're getting at. Those with the right kind of knowledge are always more confident than those without it, and a given individual is more confident after he acquires it than he was before. But haven't you ever seen men lacking knowledge of all these things, yet confident in each of them? I have, all too confident. Is their confidence courage? No, because courage would then be contemptible. These men are out of their minds. Then what do you mean by courageous men? Aren't they those who are confident? I still hold by that. So that was the first part of the reading about courage and confidence. I thought we could just maybe discuss some of what was in there before I proceed to the conclusion of the matter on courage, which is later on in the ending section of the dialogue. And wondering if there are any points here that particularly make sense to you. Does it call into question what courage is? Is Socrates right by going along the line of confidence? Is courage a question of confidence? Or is it something more fundamental? Is there a universal form of courage which somehow overcomes those who would use it in a foolish way? And I think we may have all experience people who seem courageous but do foolish things that we wouldn't do, and maybe we would call that courage, or maybe we would call that overconfidence. I'm just wondering how we see this question of confidence here. How relevant is it? And then how do we deal with the question of courage, which frankly I think I've always had a little bit of an issue with courage, in the sense that, like Protagoras, I have seen cases where what seems to be courage is actually foolish. Any thoughts on that? Because I think they're going to go on in the conclusion and look at what actually gives rise to confidence. Darren, your thoughts?
Hello, everyone. I missed the last two in the Protagoras. I was very sad about that.
We're
I
glad
had
to
a
have you here
lot of,
today.
yeah, I'm very glad to be here
Yeah.
too. And it's especially sad for me because my favorite two parts of the Protagoras probably the first two parts. But I was just really busy with work. But I caught up with all the reading, and this last part's pretty difficult. But regarding your question, I think that courage is confidence is a kind of conventional view or perception we have of courage, of what it looks like. And of course, in so many of these dialogues, well, basically all the dialogues in virtue, there's a lot of concern or contrast between what virtue conventionally looks like and what it really is. So, for instance, in the Charmides, exploring the virtue of temperance, the first definitions they explore, or that Socrates elicits from the interlocutors, is that to be temperate is to like walk in a smooth and slow manner or whatever. And there's
Mhm.
they go through all these hilarious definitions, and all these dialogues are can be amusing for this reason because people give these conventionalistic views of what a virtue is, and often it's just an appearance, it's just a social convention. Often too, it's the convention of the elites and the aristocrats. And I think what a lot of these dialogues do is show that the virtues, what is really a virtue, however we become attuned to that, can exhibit themselves in very surprising ways. And you can only recognize that in its surprising and new ways if you have a sense of what virtue really is and not just a conventional view. So when I hear that courage is confidence, I actually immediately think of Socrates. And I know you haven't read the Lakeys yet, but like I feel like so that's a dialogue in courage too. And there's explores courage in the military, in war, but there's courage in different realms of life. For instance, Socrates, I think, exhibits or yeah, in the dialogues, he often exhibits a kind of intellectual courage. And I'm actually when I see Socrates at work, so I think a lot of these dialogues, what they provide is a kind of education and how to do philosophy. And when I sort of watch Socrates at work in many of these dialogues, he doesn't necessarily have confidence, but I think he is being shown to have a kind of intellectual courage and exhibiting intellectual courage for us. So anyway, I'm just raising this question. Um, just I just want to say that yeah, I think confidence is sort of a very conventionalistic view of courage that's based on appearances, and maybe sometimes it is shown in confidence, but it's not the essence of courage. And when I read this section, I was immediately reminded of Socrates. So like alarm bells went off because yeah, I feel like Socrates is actually exhibiting something often in the dialogues. He doesn't explicitly say it, and Plato doesn't explicitly say it, but he's exhibiting it in the drama that sometimes to be intellectually virtuous is to maybe you should know what you really don't know and all the things you don't know, which is not to have confidence. That's a kind of courage too, because people like we see in the dialogue Lakey's on courage, like the generals, they're like fighting to define courage, and they try to say things with a lot of confidence, and they think this makes them like manly or whatever. But Socrates just sort of does an opposite thing. He's quiet, he's circumspect. Maybe that's courage too.
That's a really interesting perspective that courage could be admitting that you don't know, whereas sometimes the courageous, or what we think is courageous, the appearance, as you said, is pretending or showing that you know. So that's a really interesting perspective. Actually, I hadn't thought about that. Admitting that you don't know as being a courageous thing. And then you mentioned the word appearance because they actually do get into the discussion of appearance, which is I think an important perspective on courage that needs to be considered. So thanks for raising those points, and we'll go to Steve.
Hello.
Hi.
I think there's three different ideas here, and I don't they might correlate at times, but they could also diverge. You got courage and confidence and virtue. So, you can, in most cases, if you see somebody acting courageous, they give the appearance of having confidence, and probably in most cases that's the case. But that's separate from them being virtuous. You could be a gangster, a warlord, so say like somebody that's trading in blood diamonds with children warriors in Africa, or any a gangster in modern cities. And you could have confidence, you could have courage, and you have no virtue. You're perfectly fine with being unvirtuous, and you're doing courageous acts without any virtue, totally unrelated. You can also be courageous and not be confident. You know, somebody that's, say, a Ukrainian soldier that's scared out of their mind, you know, and has no confidence of that they're going to be able to survive the next day, but they pushed themselves through to do it. You know, in this case, they're defending their homeland per se, and somebody could say they're virtuous. In the example of Socrates or somebody, a philosopher, being courageous and pushing forth ideas that they think are virtuous, there's not necessarily a connection between the idea that they're being courageous to put forth a virtuous view, or that somebody else could be just as a deceitful politician that, say, in the case of Socrates' time, perhaps was like undermining the Athens because they're being paid by Sparta. So they're being courageous and confident, and not necessarily showing force or anything of that nature, but putting forth an intellectual argument for, you know, a non-virtuous means. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think those are really great examples that make us think about if virtue is, or if courage is a part of virtue, where do we draw the line, I guess, with courage in particular? I think maybe the other aspects of, or what are thought to be the other parts of virtue, maybe are a little bit more obvious, like wisdom and justice and temperance, maybe. But, you know, courage seems to be the outlier. And that's kind of what Protagoras is saying here. And it really made me think about place of courage and virtue, because it's something that you always hear as part of virtue. But then I started to think, well, is it really part of virtue, or is it only sometimes part of virtue, or is it not part of virtue at all? So thanks for those examples. I think those are really helpful. Eva, your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, virtue is considered as like a mechanism, like systems of thinking. And if it's only thinking, then it's not the virtue that we call virtue. So when you have virtue, you just like, you know, think, you process, then we expect to do something. We expect the virtuous people to show a reaction or action when it's necessary. So courage, of course, is there, but I think the main thing that really separates virtuous people and too much talking people is like the thin line of being responsible on your words. Because yeah, courage seems to be like, okay, you have to speak up and do something or say something, but on the long run it might be better if you don't say or do something and just like go with the process or try to see the big picture. So I think that is a very unique situation. Yeah, courage sometimes means that you have to speak up or do something, but there's a harder version of courage where you just do not say anything.
And that's I think maybe picking up on Darren's theme, maybe of sometimes is admitting that you don't know, or just being silent. That's a really interesting way of putting it. And the word responsibility used, I thought, was really interesting too, because you used it in the time context. So you said in the long run, one has to be concerned about responsibility. And I think that's something that we'll see in this dialogue when they start to move from a short-term perspective to a longer-term perspective. So maybe something that might seem courageous at the moment, in the long run, is actually foolish. And I think that's the key message of this dialogue, is that we need to think long-term effects of what we're doing, and maybe courage is used to demonstrate that. I like the way too that you said virtue is like a system of thinking. So maybe it's not a form in itself, but it's the way we combine knowledge. It's a particular combination of knowledge, maybe. And Socrates used the term harmonic or harmony in the previous section that we read. And so maybe there is a question of harmonizing knowledge, and maybe it's a particular harmony of knowledge that constitutes virtue. So something that we can explore, I think, as we work our way through this conclusion, in which there's a lot of threads that are twisting and turning around here. I had to admit, I read this conclusion about 6 times before it finally struck me. So yeah, I think there's some really good points there that we can pick up on that really do tie to the conclusion of this dialogue. So Darren.
Yeah, I read this a few times too, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around all the various arguments and how they stick together. But so I just want to make an observation about this section, which I think is interesting. It's one of these meta things that happen in the dialogues, which make them so like intellectually stimulating. So yeah, it's interesting that this section begins with Socrates either praising or flattering Protagoras for being so wonderful and having so much confidence in his knowledge and his abilities that he's even the first sophist ever to charge for this kind of thing and make and basically make a living off of this stuff. And so yeah, it's interesting that Protagoras is being described as having confidence, but I mean, Socrates is doing something sly here, right? Because in then raising a question, bringing their discussion back to courage, he's sort of raising the question whether Protagoras himself is virtuous, because he's only saying Protagoras is confident, not that Protagoras is courageous. So, and he's asking the question whether confidence is actually courageous. So it's sort of asking whether Protagoras is really virtuous. And I think Protagoras knows this, or he senses it, because at the very, very end, the last thing he'll say, that section, he'll say this strange thing like, I don't think I'm really a bad person, or something like that, which wouldn't be really something you say if you don't think you yourself is on the line. So just one extension of this observation too, and then I'll wrap up. Yeah, so regarding what courage looks like in the kind of work they're doing now in doing philosophy, like we'll often see that what we've seen in previous sections of this dialogue many times, and also it comes up again this time, that Protagoras often defers to, like, when he sort of gets stuck, he sort of says, well, that's what most people say, or that's what he imagines most people will say. And then Socrates, like, repeatedly in this dialogue, he'll say something like, no, I'm not asking what most people will say. What do you really think? What is it that you really think? Like, I don't care what this poem or what this text or what this, great thinker of the past says, what Kant or whomever, of course, Kant doesn't exist yet, but whatever. Like, Socrates wants to know you as a human being. What do you really think? And then he says at one point, I think last time, that this is how we actually test ideas. This is how we make sort of progress in this. Not like, talking about poems and trying to interpret them where, no one can ever agree or figure out what it really says, because, we can disagree forever. Socrates wants to put our lives at stake in a way. Like, it's about us, the human being. He thinks it's that important and urgent. Like, this is the kind of work that matters to us. And so I think what we see Protagoras often doing is, like, he seems to lack courage to take a stance for himself. He's just happy to go along saying, this is what this person said, or this is what a lot of people think, and he'll leave it at that. But of course, to put yourself at stake, to put your own views at stake, requires courage. And I think the dialogue doesn't make this connection explicit, but again, I think this is one of the many things that we often see in reading the drama, and not just what is explicitly said, which is we're being shown that, if Socrates is someone who has this surprising way of exhibiting what courage looks like in an intellectual realm, but sometimes maybe it's not having confidence and saying you don't know things and admitting you're wrong. Protagoras is an exhibition, of someone who only seems to have courage. And yeah, maybe I'll just wrap up there. Yeah.
And that's an interesting connection I hadn't thought about before, whether Socrates is questioning Protagoras' confidence and therefore courage, and courage maybe to admit what he doesn't know, because Protagoras holds to know a lot of things, and is in fact the first person to charge for such things. So that's a really interesting connection. I hadn't thought about that, but certainly at the end, the dialogue ends with Protagoras turns the compliments back to Socrates. And I say that I would be not surprised if you gain among men high repute for wisdom, as if Protagoras is the one who is qualified to determine that. And then Protagoras goes on to say, we will examine these things later, whenever you wish. Now it is time to turn our attention elsewhere. So he kind of deflects, and he kind of changes the subject, because I think it seems that he's on the ropes with that. And then you mentioned too, when he defers to what others say, there's that interesting thread throughout this dialogue where Protagoras several times says the masses just sing the tune of their leader. And so he says, do we really need to ask what the masses think? And yet he, as you said, he kind of defers to those. So, and we'll see that in the next part of this reading about courage. So
yeah, James, can I just add a quick point to what I said? So I think the thing I wanted to say at the end, I'm trying to get my thoughts together, is that I guess the implicit idea here then is that to do philosophy requires courage itself. Like to really do philosophy, I guess in the Socratic manner, where it matters for our lives, where it might have a chance of educating our virtues, requires sort of putting ourselves at stake and not just referring to ideas in the abstract, but what ourselves really think. So this idea that philosophy itself requires a certain kind of courage, which might not be a conventional appearance of what courage is like.
Yeah, I'm coming to believe that myself too. That admitting that you don't know requires more courage than demonstrating what you do know, I guess. And that's maybe why the oracle at Delphi said that Socrates was the wisest person alive, for he knew one thing, which is that he knew nothing. So yeah, interesting point about that. So thanks. And we'll go to Steve.
I'll take a shot at being Protagoras' apologist and bring up a few points counter to Darren's argument.
Sure.
So first off, the way the dialogue is started, I think it's a very, a positive term that they're going to explore together. And, in a dialogue, you need to have different points of views, and the whole idea of when, two people walking together, they can, discover more together. But I think that, again, this is the idea that the sophists are bad, air quotes, is like a propaganda of Plato for his own purposes. First off, I think too that Protagoras is not the first sophist to charge anybody. He's the first, Socrates compliments him for having the courage to openly say that he does it. So I'm going to argue that Protagoras is showing his courage in many ways here. He's open about charging. And again, it's very important, I think, to have this idea of in context. The sophists were charging, but at that point in time, it was considered, if you were charging somebody, you were a workman. It was not considered something that the land-owning elites would do. So again, in our day and time, that would be every university professor is charging for, teaching knowledge or making their living by doing this. So I think instead of being non-courageous, I think it's quite the opposite. And also, again, the Protagoras is not considered to be a small thinker or a small personage. He was very well known, and he did have quite a bit of real actual work. And actually, one thing is Protagoras is just reading a short section here that Protagoras expresses agnosticism in the matter of religion. If gods exist, their nature can be considered so different from human nature that humans would not be able to fathom them. So he's more courageous than Plato Socrates in questioning religion. And he did have a lot of problems in his life because of his courage in expressing that. Thanks.
And thanks for that context. Actually, that's interesting, and interesting especially too because the audience that Socrates and young Hippocrates are standing in front of is a bunch of sophists, including Protagoras, but others. And so maybe this is really showing a range of skill among sophists, and Protagoras maybe is the most skilled. So it's an interesting perspective on that. Yeah, and certainly Protagoras is shown with many good points in this dialogue, and I think it's a question of then maybe it's a process question. How do we go about processing inputs from people like Socrates, from people like Protagoras, and how do we go about assessing which ones are closer to the truth, which ones are closer to the good? To pick up on something I said in the introduction, and that they'll reach in the conclusion what's closer to the good. How do we weigh their opinions? And weighing is a very important part that Socrates brings in near the end of this dialogue. So thank you for that. I think that was really helpful context. Darren.
Just want to respond to what Steve said here. I think it might be helpful to actually see the dialogue, the Protagoras, in context of other dialogues on sophists, like the two Hippias dialogues, which are amazing, and there's the Gorgias, and there's others. And actually, if you compare them, you'll find that Protagoras is like put in a very positive light in this dialogue, I think. And there's ways in which Socrates is actually problematized in certain ways. For instance, we see Socrates himself being sort of overawed by Protagoras. He admits it and he has to collect himself. And then, we at one point in interpreting the Simonides poem section, Socrates says that, he thought Protagoras had like a really like knockout argument and he needed to like bide his time or delay or something. So he makes up his own flowery speech, which was kind of amusing. So like I don't know, like I don't get the sense that Protagoras is being presented as all bad here, especially if you compare with the Hippias dialogues, because all these characters, they're not flat, right? In these dialogues, they all have their own personalities and they're all abilities or inabilities. And Hippias is like an idiot sophist. Like he's like, even in this dialogue, like some of the most hilarious parts were like whenever Hippias comes up, people just sort of brush him off and dismiss him. So those are really amusing. I don't know if people noticed. So clearly, like Hippias pretends like he's really smart, but like everyone like knows he's like a sort of a vain fool. So I guess my point is that like if you compare across different dialogues in the Sophist, I think you'll find that Protagoras is not being sort of presented in like a very negative light. Pretty much all the characters get poked at in these dialogues, right? They all have their foibles. Even Socrates seems to, I think. I don't know if it has to be one or the other, that like they're either presented in a positive light or a bad light. I think there's a spectrum here, and I think Protagoras is presented on, actually, if you compare across dialogues, on the sort of more positive end.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too that Socrates does come off as being maybe more combative and maybe a little bit objectionable sometimes in this dialogue, and maybe that's deliberate. Maybe that's deliberate that Plato did that to show how one could deal with ideas expressed by somebody that we don't really like the form of expression, but maybe there's still ideas that need to be dealt with. And here Socrates has brought young Hippocrates to this audience of some of all of these great thinkers. And it'd be really interesting to be in that audience and to see how Hippocrates himself is taking in all of this scene. In fact, we don't know that from this. Hippocrates doesn't say what his thoughts are on all of this. One can imagine what it would be like to be Hippocrates, the young person who was really drawn to this event by the presence of Protagoras and Protagoras' fame. It would be really interesting to see how Hippocrates' own thinking changes during this whole process of this back and forth. So, really interesting thought.
Can I just respond to one more thing that Steve said? First thing I'll say is that I think Protagoras has a lot of actually really great arguments for in the first part of the dialogue. He gives reasons why Socrates is wrong, that virtue can't be taught. And I actually thought those arguments were pretty brilliant. So he's not being shown to be an idiot in this dialogue at all, I think. I think he's one of the most brilliant characters actually across all of the Plato's dialogues. So Steve mentioned that Protagoras exhibits a lot of courage in some of the things he says and does about religion and so on. So just a couple of things about this. I think there might be a question, like in so many of the dialogues on the virtues, whether it's courage or temperance or whatever, that someone can show a virtue in a certain way, but is it actually good, I guess? That's always the question that sort of exercises Plato and Socrates. Because like it can show itself up and it can look like it, but if it's not actually good or towards the good, then is it actually virtuous? That's sort of a naughty problem that comes up often. And and also in the way that Protagoras does challenge cultural and social or religious ideas, I would say that we see this at work actually in this very dialogue, right? In many places. And he even, talks about how he sometimes might be putting himself in danger, or sophists are. But he doesn't do it in Socrates' way, where Socrates can be quite blunt. Like at one point in part one, like when he says he doesn't think virtue can be taught, he was literally referring to people in the audience that, oh, look at these people, look at this side. Like he didn't have virtues. Like these people are literally in the audience. Like that is sort of a dangerous thing for Socrates to do. But Protagoras, when he questions, even when he seems to challenge things, he's always constantly flattering. Maybe people wish there weren't God so they can like do whatever they want, and they don't have to feel guilty. So, he'll flatter that sentiment. And like everything he says, I don't know. This is what my sense of the dialogue is that. So I think Steve is right that he does challenge things, but people are complicated, right? We have multiple, although, we might believe in gods, we also maybe we wish there weren't, or so we wouldn't have to feel guilty. So like he's obviously very good at rhetoric, and he's very good at using that. And of course, when you say something that seems challenging, it also makes you feel smart too. So I don't know. He's like he's brilliant, right? He's brilliant at doing this stuff. But to the extent he has courage and challenges people, it's at least very different than Socrates. So it might be worth reflecting on how they're different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let's do that. And certainly the flattery, I guess, is an interesting angle. And at the end, Protagoras does flatter Socrates, or tries to flatter Socrates, but maybe it comes off as a backhanded flattery. So. And what you said about the complexity of people, it brings us to the end of this discussion on courage, which I have on the screen and I can read momentarily. It starts at 358C, and they talk about what really motivates people. And I think it's the motivation maybe is the key that Socrates is trying to get at here. So we'll see that in a minute. But first, Eva, your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, Darren, I did little research on the word virtue, trying to understand, is virtue supposed to be something positive? And yes, the word virtue refers to a high moral thinking. So I think that brings in an open-ended understanding of virtue. So what I could just go ahead and call myself virtuous and just think or assume that I am being virtuous and I'm doing my best, blah, blah, blah. But in the end, it will be my option and my perspective. And a person who thinks they are virtuous might be looking really unvirtuous from another perspective. So while virtue is like a self thing, like the I person's decision, it's how it seems from outside. We need a group of people to really name it or label it as like the virtues. So it has both individual and a group dynamic, I guess. Thanks, James.
That's a fascinating way of putting it. Both individual and group, because I guess, and maybe I said this before, but we are now judging each other a lot, or societies are judging each other a lot and polarizing. And a lot of people may think that they're virtuous and proclaim their virtue, but others see them as not virtuous. So somehow we have to reconcile these perceptions of each other. And so virtue, I think what you're saying, requires at least two, or at least a consensus of two to create virtue. It's not a single thing. I really like that. That's actually very good. So thanks for that perspective, because I hadn't thought about that, but I think it's very helpful to this dialogue. So I will go ahead maybe and read the conclusion of the courage part. And this is after there has been a digression. So, but I thought it would be easier for us to maybe understand what they're saying about courage to take out that digression by just going ahead to the ending part of that discussion. And this begins at 358C. So by this point, they have digressed now to discussing pleasure versus pain. So they started off by talking about courage, then they talked about confidence as an element of courage, and then they digressed to pleasure versus pain, and now they're coming back to courage. So this is at 358C. Then if the pleasant is the good, no one who knows or believes there is something else better than what he is doing, something possible, will go on doing what he had been doing when he could be doing what is better. To give in to oneself is nothing other than ignorance, and to control oneself is nothing other than wisdom. They all agreed. So here Socrates is recounting this audience in front of the sophist and young Hippocrates. So they all agreed, he says. So Socrates went on, well then, do you say that ignorance is to have a false belief and to be deceived about matters of importance? They all agreed on this. Now, no one goes willingly toward the bad or what he believes to be bad. Neither is it in human nature, so it seems, to want to go toward what one believes to be bad instead of to the good. And when he is forced to choose between one of two bad things, no one will choose the greater if he is able to choose the lesser. They all agreed with that too. Well then, is there something you call dread or fear? And I address this to you, Protagoras. I say that whether you call it fear or dread, it is an expectation of something bad. Protagoras and Hippias thought that this was true of both dread and fear, but Protagoras thought it applied to dread, but not to fear. Well, it really does not matter, Protagoras. This is the point. If what I have said up to now is true, then would anyone be willing to go toward what he dreads when he can go toward what he does not? Or is this impossible from what we have agreed? For it was agreed that what one fears one holds to be bad, no one goes toward those things which he holds to be bad or chooses those things willingly. They all agreed. Well, Protagoras and Hippias, with this established, let Protagoras defend for us the truth of his first answer. I don't mean his very first answer, for then he said that while there are 5 parts of virtue, none is like any other, but each one has its own unique power or function. I'm not talking about this now, but about what he said later. For later he said that 4 of them are very similar to each other, but one differs very much from the others, namely courage. And he said that I would know this by the following evidence. You will find, Socrates, many people who are extremely impious, unjust, intemperate, and ignorant, and yet exceptionally courageous. By this you will recognize that courage differs very much from all the other parts of virtue. So I was very surprised at his answer then, and even more so now that I've gone over these things with you. I asked him then if he said that the courageous were confident, and he said, yes, and ready for action too. Do you remember giving this answer? He said he did. Well then, tell us, for what actions are the courageous ready? The same actions as the cowardly? No. Different actions? Yes. Do the cowardly go forward to things which inspire confidence, and the courageous toward things to be feared? So it is said by most people. Right, but I'm not asking that. Rather, what do you say the courageous go boldly toward? Toward things to be feared, believing them to be fearsome, or towards things not to be feared? But what you have just said, the former is impossible. Right again. So if our demonstration has been correct, then no one goes toward the things he considers to be fearsome, since not to be in control of oneself was found to be ignorance. He agreed. But all people, both the courageous and the cowardly, go toward that about which they are confident. Both the cowardly and the courageous go toward the same things. But Socrates, what the cowardly go toward is completely opposite to what the courageous go toward. For example, the courageous are willing to go to war, but the cowardly are not. Is going to war honorable or is it disgraceful? Honorable. Then if it is honorable, as we have agreed before, it is also good, for we agreed that all honorable actions were good. Very true, and I have always believed this. And rightly. But who would you say are not willing to go to war, war being honorable and good? The cowardly? If a thing is noble and good, is it also pleasant? This was definitely agreed upon. So the cowardly, with full knowledge, are not willing to go toward the more honorable, the better, and more pleasant. If we agree to that, we will undermine what we agreed on earlier. What about the courageous man? Does he go toward the more honorable, the better, and more pleasant? We must agree to that. So generally, when the courageous fear, their fear is not disgraceful, nor when they are confident is their confidence disgraceful. True. If not disgraceful, is it honorable? He agreed. If honorable, then also good? Yes. Whereas the fear and confidence of the cowardly, the foolhardy, and madmen are disgraceful. He agreed. Is their confidence disgraceful and bad for any reason other than ignorance and stupidity? No, it isn't. Now then, that through which cowardly people are cowardly, do you call it cowardice or courage? Cowardice. And aren't cowards shown to be so through their ignorance of what is to be feared? Absolutely. So they are cowards because of that ignorance? He agreed. You agree that it is through cowardice that they are cowards? He said he did. So can we conclude that cowardice is ignorance of what is and is not to be feared? He nodded. Now courage is the opposite of cowardice. He said yes. So then, wisdom about what is and is not to be feared is the opposite of this ignorance. He nodded again. And this ignorance is cowardice? He nodded again very reluctantly. So the wisdom about what is and is not to be feared is courage, and is the opposite of this ignorance. He would not even nod at this. He remained silent. So that's kind of the conclusion of the discussion about courage and cowardice involving confidence. And it seems that Socrates has brought it to a conclusion that really it either is a function, either courage or cowardice, however, whatever name we apply to it, is really a consequence of knowledge. And what do we think about that? Is it really fundamentally knowledge that we're talking about here, rather than some thing called courage, which has some sort of power on its own? In other words, if somebody is uncertain about whether to do something, is it courage that makes them certain? Like, is there a thing called courage with its own power that can cause somebody to do something which they were otherwise uncertain about? Or is it knowledge that causes them to act? I think maybe here maybe Socrates is trying to make some extension then from courage to what are held to be the other parts of virtue. And maybe it's all knowledge. Darren.
Yeah, I found this last section, or this part 3, to be quite difficult. And I think what you read sort of gave it a taste of why that might be. There's just a lot of like dense argumentation here. And it's all connected. So it's hard to keep track of everything. So yeah, regarding the question of knowledge and whether it's like I don't really exactly know what's going on here, but I think it might be helpful to think about what kind of knowledge we're talking about and knowledge what. I think there might be different sorts that are being suggested. And the thing that jumped out at me was any section here. So yeah, back at 354b to 355, when there are, so this goes back to the discussion of pleasure and pain, and whether that's the only good thing in life, whether that's the good. Socrates constantly asks like 4 or 5 times in a row here whether Protagoras might have some other view of what good is. Like, he repeatedly asks this, and so I feel like Plato is flagging something here. And of course, each time Protagoras says no, it's all just pleasure and pain. That's all that ultimately matters. But I think that, especially in the way that Socrates raises this question, he says here in this section, I'll just read this one example out loud here. Even now, it is still possible to withdraw, like his view, if you're able to say that the good is anything other than pleasure, or that the bad is anything other than pain. Or is it enough for you to live life pleasantly without pain? So the way he puts the question, right, is that repeatedly here is, are you able to say that the good is anything other than pleasure or pain? And Protagoras, of course, says no. But this idea of whether you're able to say the good is anything else, like, this evokes the ideas from other dialogues, right? If for people who are more familiar with the other ones, where there is more direct discussion of the good and what this mysterious thing, the good, is itself, that James also helped us with at the very beginning of this conversation, when he talked about the Republic. And it's not something that's like explicitly sayable, even though supposedly it it sort of governs our thinking. And so yeah, this idea of like what we have to know. So anyway, I just want to say that maybe the knowledge that matters for virtue is this knowledge of it is knowledge, but it's not knowledge like an apple is red or whatever. It's like something special, and which is knowledge of the good. And I think that's what's being flagged here. Of course, it's not developed at all in this dialogue, but like, I don't know. I feel like the section that I just brought up here, I feel like it's really flagging that this is what Socrates is at least trying to like get us to have a sense of.
For sure. I do have a reading actually from that section from 353C to 355E that I'll do next. And it really does talk about knowledge of the good. And that's something where maybe we can get into understanding what the good is. Virtue does definitely seem to be something good, as Eva pointed out, that it has that positive connotation to it. But the question is whether virtue itself has any power over us, or is the power over us really in us, in our knowledge of the good? And I think that's what Socrates is coming to the conclusion, is that if virtue is a separate thing, having powers of its own, or having parts, and each part has powers of its own, and somehow these parts tie to the whole, then that means that we aren't able to govern ourselves. Ultimately, if we don't have virtue, we're ungovernable. And he kind of talks about that. We'll see that in the next reading. So what is it that really drives us? Is it some outside force called virtue? If we are lucky enough to possess it, we're good. If we're not lucky enough to possess it, or not lucky enough to have teachers like Protagoras, then we may be bad. I think Socrates is saying that humanity is more powerful than that. And I find that actually an uplifting message from this. It's a powerful message, I think. So, but we'll see that coming to the conclusion. I just, I point to two things in that reading that I just did. Socrates uses the word reason, and it relates maybe to what he says in the Republic about the soul being divided into three parts, where reason mediates spirit and appetite. And so maybe it's a question of reason. Virtue is a question of reason, finding the reason to be good. And I just actually noticed this word disgraceful, which appears several times in what I just read. And it just occurred to me that Socrates, it was Protagoras who brought in earlier in his story about Epimetheus and Prometheus, which we'll see at the end, Socrates turns back to. But in that story, he said that humanity was endowed with shame and justice, a sense of shame and justice. And so here, maybe we're questioning whether shame really has power over people like virtue. So maybe shame is kind of the opposite of virtue. And so is shame something that really drives us, or is it something else that drives us? So the word disgraceful, I think, really calls into mind that power of shame, or that attribute of shame that we're supposed to have. So thanks for those. Steve, I saw your hand up. Did you want to say anything, or?
I'll try and be brief. Just I think the idea of courage being related to knowledge, and the biggest aspects I think we have to look at is the evolutionary adaptation. Most of where these cases of courage are cited are things where you're involved in some sort of basically tribal rivalry that's extended to nations, and it's something that evolved as a adaptation that the survival of the tribe related to the courage. And then there's also the cultural reinforcement of those. So the shame and disgrace and dishonor, all of those are cultural. Say if the evolutionary or hardwiring, these might be software adaptations in order to keep the cohesion of the society. So it's not necessarily an idea of knowledge that's driving. If you a soldier on the front lines, what's going to determine whether they're courageous? Not necessarily their knowledge about any grand theme. It's more likely to be their biological and cultural urges, per se, in lack of a better word, to do that, what is considered the courageous thing, and also what is biologically courageous for the group, is more of an emphasis on what they're going to do than knowledge per se, or virtue.
Mm-hmm. It's a good connection, and it reminds us of what we talked about, I think maybe starting in the first episode, is whether virtue is something societally based, or based on families, and whether it's therefore something that's variable over time and therefore not a form. And I think Socrates concludes it's not a form, but how variable it is, I guess, in question. So yeah, that's a really good, interesting connection about shame being something that is part of our social adaptation, perhaps, and keeps societies together. But then maybe it leads to that tyranny of convention that Socrates talked about earlier, that, if it's taken too far and the sense of shame is exploited too much, then people are acting from that and not thinking about other ways that they could act. So that's an interesting connection. And certainly it was Protagoras who said earlier that Zeus kept the knowledge of political wisdom to himself. For some reason, he doesn't say why Zeus kept that to himself, but a sense of shame and justice were brought upon us so that we would keep our societies together, and that it wasn't something else that would keep our societies together. So I don't know why Zeus kept this knowledge to himself. If he had the knowledge, why didn't he share it? But I think that's an important point to make. I have another reading here, if we're ready, and this ties into the subject of knowledge. This is, as I mentioned before, from 351C to 353A, and this is where they sort of really start to play on the theme of knowledge. So Socrates is now questioning pleasure versus pain. This is a little bit earlier than what I read before. It says, so then, to live pleasantly is good and unpleasantly bad? Yes, so long as he lived having taken pleasure in honorable things. What, Protagoras? Surely you don't, like most people, call some pleasant things bad and some painful things good? I mean, isn't a pleasant thing good just insofar as it is pleasant? That is, if it results in nothing other than pleasure. And on the other hand, aren't painful things bad in the same way, just insofar as they are painful? I don't know, Socrates, if I should answer as simply as you put the question, that everything pleasant is good and everything painful is bad. It seems to me to be safer to respond not merely with my present answer in mind, but from the point of view of my life overall, that on the one hand, there are pleasurable things which are not good, and on the other hand, there are painful things which are not bad, but some which are, and a third class which is neutral, neither bad nor good. You call pleasant things those which partake of pleasure or produce pleasure? Certainly. So my question is this, just insofar as things are pleasurable, are they good? I'm asking whether pleasure itself is not a good. Just as you always say, Socrates, let us inquire into this matter, and if your claim seems reasonable and it is established that pleasure and the good are the same, then we will come to agreement. Otherwise, we will disagree. Do you wish to lead this inquiry, or shall I? It is fitting for you to lead, for it is you who brought up the idea. All right, well, let's help to make it clear. When someone evaluates a man's health or other functions of the body through his appearance, he looks at the face and extremities and might say, show me your chest and back too, so that I can make a better examination. That's the kind of investigation I want to make. Having seen how you stand on the good and the pleasant, I need to say something like this to you. Come now, Protagoras, and reveal this about your mind. What do you think about knowledge? Do you go along with the majority or not? Most people think this way about it, that it is not a powerful thing, neither a leader nor a ruler. They do not think of it in that way at all, but rather in this way. While knowledge is often present in a man, what rules him is not knowledge, but rather anything else. Sometimes anger, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, at other times love, often fear. They think of this knowledge as being utterly dragged around by all these other things as if it were a slave. Now, does the matter seem like that to you, or does it seem to you that knowledge is a fine thing capable of ruling a person? And if someone were to know what is good and bad, then he would not be forced by anything to act otherwise than as knowledge dictates, and intelligence would be sufficient to save a person. Not only does it seem just as you say, Socrates, but further, it would be shameful indeed for me above all people to say that wisdom and knowledge are anything but the most powerful forces in human activity. Right you are. You realize that most people aren't going to be convinced by us. They maintain that most people are unwilling to do what is best, even though they know what it is and are able to do it. And when I have asked them the reason for this, they say that those who act that way do so because they are overcome by pleasure or pain, or are being ruled by one of the things I referred to just now. I think people say a lot of other things erroneously too, Socrates. Come with me then, and let's try to persuade people and to teach them what is this experience which they call being overcome by pleasure, because of which they fail to do the best thing when they know what it is. Or perhaps if we told them what they were saying isn't true, but is demonstrably false, they would ask us, Protagoras and Socrates, if this is not the experience of being overcome by pleasure, but something other than that, what do you two say it is? Tell us. Socrates, why is it necessary for us to investigate the opinion of ordinary people who will say whatever occurs to them? That's the end of that part of the reading, I think, which brings in a number of things that we've already talked about in terms of Protagoras's view of the average person, I guess, right there at the end, which he makes a number of references to throughout the dialogue. And again, he called into attention the word shame or shameful. He said it would be shameful indeed for me above all people to say that wisdom and knowledge are anything but the most powerful forces in human activity. So that's an interesting comparison, because on the one hand, he's saying knowledge is the most powerful. And then on the other hand, he's saying shame, I'm prevented by shame from saying anything otherwise. So he's giving shame as a reason, but he's also saying knowledge is the highest thing. So what is he really saying? What's his real motivation, I guess, is maybe what Socrates is trying to call to attention with highlighting these words. And ultimately, if we are to act, is our action best based on knowledge, or is it best based on some constraint of virtue? If somebody teaches us virtue, is that sufficient to constrain us? Is that sufficient to save us from the bad? So there's the part where Socrates tries to highlight, that people don't maybe place enough emphasis on knowledge, that they think that knowledge is there. Knowledge gets in the way of what we want to do, I think, is what he says often. And so that's that part where he says they think of his knowledge as being utterly dragged around by all those other things as if it were a slave. So because knowledge is so susceptible to be overridden by our appetites and by our spirit, and reason loses its capacity sometimes, he's saying this is the reason why we need virtue, because reason is sometimes just doesn't work. And so virtue would come in here and save us from the bad by filling in the gap when reason is missing in action. Eva, and then Darren.
Yeah, James, I wish I could answer that question. That's a tough one. But I'm curious to maybe understand, if we think virtue is taught, what is the motivation of the teacher? I don't believe virtue can be taught. It's a personal and unique outcome of life experiences, and I think virtue is unique to each person. But if we want to think as like, okay, let's raise this virtuous generation, or let's raise virtuous people, I would want to just question, what is the motivation of this person who thinks they are teaching virtue? What is the advantage? And who is giving them that authority? Because I'm not sure if you're familiar, if you were able to see the TikTok and American Congress discussions. It seems like we would just think like US Congress people would be logical, they would be all, I would want to think like they would be virtuous. So they all were connected, and they have their own opinion, all the same opinion on one thing. Yeah, I don't think this is an easy question to ask.
Very true. I think too, that's what maybe Socrates was trying to warn Hippocrates about at the beginning. Hippocrates runs into Socrates' house. Socrates isn't really even out of bed yet. And Hippocrates says, I'm really anxious to see this teacher. And Socrates says, well, beware. If you're going to consume his product and pay him money for it, then be a knowledgeable consumer. So I think he's saying being a knowledgeable consumer of knowledge. And when you don't have the knowledge yourself, look to people who care about you for their advice. So yeah, because as you're right, it's very hard to understand what the motivations are. Sometimes it's money, and maybe Socrates is making maybe a bit of an unfair implication here that Protagoras is doing this just for money, although Protagoras is said to have charged the highest fee of anybody else. So money certainly seems to be some sort of a motivation, but is he more motivated by money than anything else? And then Steve mentioned earlier, every university professor is potentially a sophist, I guess, but we have to make a living. And so, I think they're not necessarily the best paid people in the world. And a lot of them do it really for love of knowledge. But it's hard to tell the difference, like what is really motivating them. So being a knowledgeable consumer seems to be the key.
And it could be power too.
Yeah.
Not related too much with the money.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And that's why Socrates, again, at the beginning said, when you consume a teaching, it affects your soul and you can't undo it. It's not like food. You buy food in the store. He said, you can take it home and inspect it. And if it's not good, you can discard it before you consume it. With teachings like things about virtue, it sits in your soul. Once it's in there, you don't get rid of it. It's in there. And then you have to then judge for yourself. And maybe then it starts to form a life of its own. If you don't continually seek to learn and question, and if you just consume it from one person and you think that person's great, I'm not going to listen to anybody else, that's really what virtue is, then as you say, that could lead to incredible power, I think. Yeah. And that's a danger. I think that's clearly a danger that he's talking about. The soul, once it absorbs something, it can't unabsorb it. The only way it can override that learning is to learn something else, and use reason. So the question here in this section that I just read is does reason sometimes fail? Are we faulty to start off with, that our reason sometimes fails? Or if our reason fails, is it because we let it fail? We let our guard down, maybe. And that's what he's maybe calling into question. I like that. So thank you for that. And Darren. You're on.
Yeah, sorry, I was reaching for the lower hand button rather than the unmute. Okay, just a couple things. I noticed, so in the start of this passage here, where at 351e, where Protagoras says, "Just as you always say, Socrates, let us inquire into this matter, and if your claim seems reasonable and it is established that pleasure and the good are the same, then we will come to agreement. Otherwise, we will disagree." So this is actually, I think it's a strange shift here. I think it might be one of those things that when Socrates at the very end of this dialogue sort of says that we have to go through everything all over again. Maybe this is one of the things we're supposed to sort of catch, because it's a strange shift, because like I'm pretty sure up to now Socrates was talking about pleasure as being a good. And here, Protagoras changes the question to whether the pleasure and the good are the same, which is a very different thing.
Yeah.
So that's just identifying them very closely. And so, of course, we see later on that, if you say the good is pleasure, then you can sort of create all sorts of funny business by just replacing the words in various sentences, replacing the word good with pleasure or pleasure with good. And then you end up with all sorts of weird consequences in a lot of areas. So I feel like that shift is weird. So maybe that's just one observation. The other thing is just respond to what you were saying, James, about that stuff on like shame talks about later. He says whether Protagoras is running into sort of knots. And I actually think that's what's sort of happening, that Protagoras is sort of, and he even sort of has to put some daylight between himself and the masses, because usually he's flattering the masses, especially the Athenians and the people in the audience. But here he's like, the people say wrong things all the time, which would seem kind of like uncharacteristic. But like my sense is that, like I acknowledge, like we might interpret this in different ways, but like maybe this is like his own true, genuine, deeper view, which could also be true. But I feel like what's happening here is that Socrates has led him to this train of thought where he has to acknowledge like that knowledge is, the most powerful thing or whatever. And and he says, but Socrates is like, but the masses don't think this. And then Protagoras, sort of has to be dragged along here. He's sort of being dragged along too. And so like the sense I get from this is like this drama, this dialogue is sort of unique. They're like Socrates is trying very hard. And I feel like it's because maybe Protagoras is such a great interlocutor, and the dialogue is actually showing that. So contrary to maybe what Steve was saying earlier, and Socrates is like trying really hard to find like certain cracks in the armor, and he does find them. And
it's hard for them but it's hard for him to find them, and he has to go in these digressions, right?
Exactly. And he has
you and I both had to read this multiple times to figure it out. Yeah.
Exactly. And these very long digressions and these very difficult arguments. And it seems like at times, like even Protagoras wins the argument. And so Socrates changes the argument, like he goes in a different direction. But I think he is sort of successful in the end, though, Socrates, after all this effort and on their part and also on our part reading it. But ultimately, like Protagoras at the very end does something he hasn't really done for the rest of the dialogue. He admits that there's an open question and that they should keep exploring. And so after all that effort, we finally like find a little crack where I think that's what Socrates wants people, because I think Plato and Socrates think that's what like is the best thing for us to have to enter a philosophical life where we're searching for these truths, not necessarily being like just taught them as in being we're being imbibing truths or whatever. And I think he finally manages to get, after a lot of effort, Protagoras to get to that point where the life that is being led is like a philosophical life where you're asking and raising the questions, the problems, and not just like, giving speeches about what you know and all that.
And that's a good tie-in maybe to the Meno, where Socrates says, seek to question and learn. And that's, that was a dialogue of knowledge as well, which I think maybe is the upshot of this, is to keep our reason functioning, we have to continue questioning and learning. Otherwise, our reason stops functioning.
Yeah. And it's like, we have to arrive at a place where there's kind of openness to a problem that, maybe we don't know what virtue is, but like it's a word, and it's it's a sort of a thing that seems to be real, in that we seem to think with this idea, even if it's across cultures, it's different. It seems to be, as Steve has brought up, it's still something we like. It's interesting that it is a concept that seems to exist across all cultures, I feel like. So I don't know, I just want to sort of present an idea of what might be happening here in this dialogue.
Interesting. Yeah. And you mentioned whether pleasure is the good maybe at one time, but is it good at all times? And that gets us into the time dimension of this, which I set out in the next reading. So I'll get to that shortly. I just, Fernando, I saw your hand up and didn't know if you would like to contribute a thought, or you're on mute. You're okay. All right. Well, if you have any points, Fernando, by all means, contribute. And let me just go on then to read this part here from 353C to 355E. And this is where Socrates is talking about weighing knowledge of cause and effect of good and bad over time. And so judging whether a thing is good is not something that we do necessarily immediately, but it's something that we do over time. And this weighing comes into question, or comes into play. And it really does recall what Socrates has said in other dialogues, including the Philebus, which we talked about before this dialogue, and a number of other dialogues. And we find in this section, actually, near the end, Socrates talks about even and odd numbers again. And it's a curious reference again, but I think really we need to at some point address why Socrates in multiple dialogues keeps bringing up the difference between even and odd. So let me just go ahead and read this section here. So starting at 353C. Going back then, if they should ask us, we have been speaking of being overcome by pleasure. What do you say this is? I would reply to them this way. Listen, Protagoras and I will try to explain it to you. Do you hold, gentlemen, that this happens to you in circumstances like these? You are often overcome by pleasant things like food and drink and sex, or do you do these things all the while knowing they are ruinous? They would say yes. Then you and I would ask them again, in what sense do you call these things ruinous? Is it that each of them is pleasant in itself and produces immediate pleasure, or is it that later they bring about diseases and poverty and many other things of that sort? Or even if it doesn't bring about these things later, but gives only enjoyment, would it still be a bad thing just because it gives enjoyment in whatever way? Can we suppose then, Protagoras, that they would make any other answer than that bad things are bad, not because they bring about immediate pleasure, but rather because of what happens later, disease and things like that? I think that is how most people would answer. And in bringing about diseases and poverty, do they bring about pain? I think they would agree. Yes. Does it not seem to you, my good people, as Protagoras and I maintain, that these things are bad on account of nothing other than the fact that they result in pain and deprive us of other pleasures? Would they agree? Protagoras concurred. Then again, suppose we were to ask them the opposite question. You who say that some painful things are good, do you not say that such things as athletics and military training and treatments by doctors, such as cautery, surgery, medicines, and starvation diet, are good things even though painful? Would they say so? Yes. Would you call these things good for the reason that they bring about intense pain and suffering, or because they ultimately bring about health and good condition of bodies and preservation of cities and power over others and wealth? Would they agree? Yes. These things are good only because they result in pleasure and in the relief and avoidance of pain? Or do you have some other criterion of view other than pleasure and pain on the basis of which you would call these things good? They say no, I think. And I would agree with you. So then you pursue pleasure as being good and avoid pain as bad? Yes. So this you regard as bad. Pain and pleasure you regard as good, since you call the very enjoying of something bad whenever it deprives us of greater pleasures than it itself provides, or brings about greater pains than the very pleasures inherent in it. But if you call the very enjoying of something bad for some other reason, and with some other criterion in view than the one I have suggested, you could tell us what it is, but you won't be able to. I don't think they'll be able to either. And likewise, concerning the actual state of being in pain, do you call the actual condition of being in pain good, whether it relieves pains greater than the ones it contains or brings about greater pleasures than its attendant pains? Now, if you are using some other criterion than the one I have suggested, when you call the very condition of being pain good, you can tell us what it is, but you won't be able to. Truly spoken. Now again, gentlemen, if you ask me, why are you going on so much about this and in so much detail? I would reply, forgive me. First, it is not easy to show what it is that you call being overcome by pleasure. And then it is upon this very point that all the arguments rest. But even now, it is still possible to withdraw if you are able to say that the good is anything other than pleasure, or that the bad is anything other than pain. Or is it enough for you to live life pleasantly without pain? If it is enough, and you are not able to say anything else than that the good and the bad are that which result in pleasure and pain, listen to this. For I say to you that if this is so, your position would become absurd when you say that frequently a man, knowing the bad to be bad, nevertheless does that very thing when he is able not to do it, having been driven and overwhelmed by pleasure. And again, when you say that a man, knowing the good, is not willing to do it on account of immediate pleasure, having been overcome by it. Just how absurd this is will become very clear if we do not use so many names at the same time. Pleasant and painful, good and bad. But since those turned out to be only two things, let us instead call them by two names. First, good and bad, and then later, pleasant and painful. On that basis, then, let us say that a man, knowing bad things to be bad, does them all the same. If then someone asks us why, having been overcome, we shall reply. By what, he will ask us. We are no longer able to say by pleasure, for it has taken on its other name, the good, instead of pleasure. So we will say in reply that he is overcome. By what? He will ask. By the good, we will say, for heaven's sakes. If by chance the questioner is rude, he might burst out laughing and say, what you're saying is ridiculous. Someone does what is bad, knowing that it is bad, when it is not necessary to do it, having been overcome by the good. So, he will say, within yourself, does the good outweigh the bad? We will clearly say in reply that it does not. For if it did, the person who we say is overcome by pleasure would not have made any mistake. In virtue of what, he might say, does the good outweigh the bad, or the bad the good? Only in that one is greater and one is smaller, or more and less. So in the reading of that part there's a number of concepts in there which hinge on this idea of weighting. I like that question. In virtue of what does the good outweigh the bad, or the bad the good? And Socrates concludes that it's in knowing what is greater and what is smaller, or more and less. More good than bad, more bad than good. So as I said in the introduction, is it possible to know the good wholly, like to know everything that's good, the good itself? And recalling what Socrates said about the good, the form of the good in the Republic, the form of the good is that which gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower. So maybe the good by that nature cannot itself be known because it gives us the power to know. So if we don't know the absolute good itself, if there's no form of virtue which leads us to the absolute, or which takes us definitely to the absolute good, then is it really a question of weighing probabilities and understanding which lead to the greater good and which avoid the greater bad? So reducing the bad to a minimum and maximizing the good. And here, this weighting is not done at one particular moment. There's the talk about immediate and later. It produces immediate pleasure, or is it that later they bring about diseases and poverty and many other things of that sort? So we don't look at just what's good at the moment, because maybe that's how we become overcome by pleasure, is thinking, well, that's great, let's just do it. But we don't use our reason then, and our reason necessarily invokes time to understand how these things are going to turn out, because we don't know what the absolute good is. So we don't know absolutely how things are going to turn out. Even if they seem good at the moment, we have to think through time, and thinking through time involves this waiting. And so in our own experience, I wonder whether we think that's true. I mean, I kind of relate to that personally. I think that's really true. When I make mistakes, it tends to be when I take short-term thinking and I don't think through the consequences fully, and I fail to account for how others will react to what I do, or to some of the possible outcomes of what I do. So I might just focus on a few good outcomes, and I might not see the other possible outcomes, and those can come to be. And if they come to be and I haven't thought about them, then am I driving myself towards the good, or is my reason failing in that case if I become overwhelmed by what we think is the good? So Eva, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think your example helped, because I believe it might be an easier discussion if we talked in the perspective of the focus or the goal. So if your goal is to be healthier, and you know that you're convinced that you need an operation, so one might appreciate that suffering or pain. It really, I think the focus determines that. And speaking about virtuous people, or let's say virtue-oriented people, they do not look for the daily pleasure or momentarily pleasure. They have a goal, and that goal is usually a long-term goal. I say the more you focused on the goal and use your focus and see the motivation as like a path, then suffering's definition changes. It looks like you need to go through stuff that's not suffering anymore. That might be considered like the steps. Yeah, I think the higher person gets with the goals, focusing on the goals, all these definitions shift in a way that they could even be opposite. But if you are just like a person just living the day or the week, you just work and order pizza and beer dinner on Friday, and that's like your weekly pleasure, then yeah, there is suffering. And like, why would you suffer? Because like that was, you worked for a week and you deserve a good weekend with what you can reach at that time. Yeah, did I make this more complicated?
No, by all means, I really like that suffering's definition changes. I really like that. With that goal in mind, I think that's a great perspective that really helps me to understand this section as well, that what we might see initially as pain, we're just defining it incorrectly. And if we take the long view, what seemed like pain at the moment really becomes the pleasure of being better later on, I guess. So yeah, I think that's essential, and not to fall into that sort of convention or tyranny of convention, just doing the same thing always just because it provides that momentary relief from something that's really requires a longer term view. So yeah, thank you. It was really good. Darren, your thoughts?
So I actually had some issues with Socrates' argument here. I have issues with it, but I also get like that he's trying to make a point about the good. Because here on this section you just read, ultimately he puts all pleasures and pains at all times on an equal scale. Like it doesn't matter if the pleasure or pain is very far in the future. We're gonna weigh exactly the same as it is now, as if it's happening now. Which like I don't think we actually do that. Like if there's a pleasure or pain really far in the future, like as he said, there's a probability kind of calculation. And something that might happen 50 years from now, like I don't actually know if it's rational to weigh it exactly the same as something that's immediately in front of. I'm not saying it has no weight, but here like his argument clearly is putting everything on an equal, all pains and pleasures universally across time on sort of an equal scale, and weighing that and then balancing that. Like first of all, that's like kind of impossible, but secondly, even if it were possible, like I don't know if that's rational, because something, again, like really far in the future, like at least from a human perspective and what are we're capable of doing and knowing and thinking, it doesn't seem, I don't know if that's rational. So I don't know, when I was reading this, I wasn't really sure about this argument. But I do see Socrates' point in that, like as you were saying, like it's hard for us to know what is ultimately good, because something that seems like a good idea might turn out for the worse like many years from now. But I guess what Socrates and maybe Plato often do is that they're pointing out that maybe hypothetically there is this thing that is ultimately good. It's just very hard for us as a human being to access it or to know it. And actually, this comes back to I listened to last week's podcast, and I was a bit saddened there wasn't that much discussion of the poem, because I love that section. I think it's so provocative. And like one of the things that the poem surprisingly says is that the problem with saying that it's hard to be good, the reason why it's wrong is that it's actually, according to Simonides, it's impossible to be good. Because things are always changing, are always susceptible to failing, that like as a human being we can't be good. So, and then there was this lovely line in the poem where like he'll be satisfied with just any ordinary good that human can achieve, and he'll praise that, otherwise there'll be nothing to praise. So I don't know, like there's all these tensions in Plato, right? Like there is this ideal he thinks that we need to be open to and head towards, like that metaphor in Phaedrus about heading towards the good. Once we find something on earth that we love, that's when the journey begins. But there's always a tension, because like in the Phaedrus or in the poem here, for instance, it's not like we ever attain it. Like we grab the good and we have it and it's ours, or we become the good. There's always a distance there too. So I think maybe often some of the confusions about Plato may come from these tensions. It just comes up here again, like between whether we can know something that's universally good, that's universally good across all time, but also where the human being sits, actual human being with our human capacity, sits in relation to that. So sort of have to think it all at once, which isn't always easy.
Well, that's for sure. Yeah, and it's actually really interesting that you brought the poem back into it, that it said it is impossible to be good. It's only possible to become good, I think is what he's saying. To be good itself would be impossible. So that's a good point to bring into this discussion. Whether he's putting good and bad on the same scale at the same time. I think this section in the next part that I was going to read from 356A to 357A maybe addresses that. If I get time to read it, there's just this paragraph that says, "Since this is so, I will say to them, answer me this. Do things of the same size appear to you larger when seen near at hand and smaller when seen from a distance?" And here I think he's talking about the relativity of time. So I think he's cautioning us that we don't put it on the same scale, that we factor time into the equation, because time, there's lots of probabilities that will come into play. The more time that passes, the more probabilities that will come into play. So we'll see if we get to this section, but I think that was, I'm glad you brought up that point, because I think he does address it. So thanks. Steve, your thoughts?
On one of Darren's earlier points about the difficulties of humans to go after a long-term good instead of short-term. It's just to point out that that's something that happens like all the time. Just think of parents raising young children. Everything they're doing in order for that child to survive is for the long-term good of that survival. And they put off many short-term pleasures and things that might be most convenient for them. So that's another thing. And then your footnote 15, talking about what Prometheus gave to humans and what Zeus retained. I think it's an excellent metaphor to talking about just what Zeus or the gods or some foundation keeps that requires people to be subservient in order to worship or give precedence to some other, the other or otherness over and above. That's like something that the gods withheld for themselves. Thanks.
And thanks for bringing that perspective into that story of Epimetheus and Prometheus, which is the one that Protagoras gave in his first speech. And yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Zeus retaining the power of political wisdom, because then that would allow people to seek that which is greater than their immediate pleasure, I guess, maybe. It's interesting, actually, that you brought that up, because in the conclusion, maybe just I'll shift to the conclusion, actually, now. Here, this is from 361b to 361e. Maybe I'll just read this here, because Socrates does talk about Prometheus here, and he talks about forethought. So the story again about Epimetheus and Prometheus was that they were given the power to distribute, to furnish and to distribute powers to all of the living species. Epimetheus begged Prometheus to do this on his own, and Prometheus said, okay. Epimetheus distributed all the powers, but he forgot about time, and so before his time ran out, he had distributed all the powers to all of the species except humans. And so he did not exercise forethought about the probabilities in time that he would run out of powers to distribute. And so Socrates has this wonderful line at the end here. So I'll just read this bit, starting at 361b. It seems to me that our discussion has turned on us, and if it had a voice of its own, it would say mockingly, Socrates and Protagoras, how ridiculous you are, both of you. Socrates, you said earlier that virtue cannot be taught, but now you are arguing the very opposite and have attempted to show that everything is knowledge, justice, temperance, courage, in which case virtue would appear to be eminently teachable. On the other hand, if virtue is anything other than knowledge, as Protagoras has been trying to say, then it would clearly be unteachable. But if it turns out to be wholly knowledge, as you now urge, Socrates, it would be very surprising indeed if virtue would not be taught. Now, Protagoras maintained at first that it could be taught, but now he thinks the opposite, urging that hardly any of the virtues turn out to be knowledge. On that view, virtue could hardly be taught at all. Now, Protagoras, seeing that we have gotten this topsy-turvy and terribly confused, I am most eager to clear it up, and I would like us, having come this far, to continue until we come through to what virtue is in itself, and then to return to inquire about whether it can or cannot be taught, so that Epimetheus might not frustrate us a second time in this inquiry, as he neglected us in the distribution of powers and abilities in your story. I like the Prometheus character in your story better than Epimetheus. Since I take a Promethean forethought over my life as a whole, I pay attention to these things, and if you are willing, as I said at the beginning, I would be pleased to investigate them along with you. And then Protagoras concludes, Socrates, I commend your enthusiasm and the way you find your way through an argument. I really don't think I am a bad man, certainly the last man to harbor ill will. Indeed, I've told many people that I admire you more than anyone I have met, certainly more than anyone in your generation. And I say that I would not be surprised if you gain among men high repute for wisdom. We will examine these things later, whenever you wish. Now it is time to turn our attention elsewhere. And there's that kind of irony there that Protagoras was the one who was willing to be long-winded and never wanted to end, and Socrates kept saying, I'm busy, I need to get out of here, let's wrap this thing up sooner. And now Socrates at the end is saying, well, I'm willing to stay around and discuss this, and Protagoras is the one who brings things to an end. So I really like that. But again in there, so Socrates says that he takes a Promethean forethought over my life as a whole. And when he says my life as a whole, that's actually recalling what we heard Protagoras saying earlier. Protagoras said, I won't tell you what I think about it immediately. I will take the view of my life as a whole and give you that answer. So they kind of both take that perspective of time and what they're saying. So thanks for bringing that up. And I think that's a really good connection to the conclusion. Darren.
Yeah, I love this ending. So I guess something we haven't really brought up yet is that section where he talks about the art of measurement as being our salvation in life. So I feel like it relates to some of the things you're saying, some of the things in this last passage about taking a perspective of our life as a whole. Mm-hmm. But it really sort of raises the stakes when this knowledge is framed as our salvation in life and saving our lives. When I read that, I can't help but think that, so of course, Socrates was executed. So I don't know what to make of that connection, but I can't help but think of it. And I'm sure the readers of this dialogue back then would have that in mind too. But also, apparently, this dialogue takes place at the height of Athens' power and prestige and grandeur. And so apparently everything is downhill from here. So it's a bit chilling. And Athens is going to lose a war against Sparta. It's like Plato raising a question, like there's something they haven't figured out here, even though this is important. And so I just want to make a couple observations about this last section, I guess. So I was just looking at this part about how Socrates says our discussion has turned on us. I really like this because it sort of makes the philosophical discussion like it has a life of its own, like it personifies it. And I think that's very much in keeping with, Socrates' emphasis on dialectic and the social aspects of philosophy and truth. So I really like how he sort of personifies the discussion itself. And okay, I sort of remember what I was going to say before. This will be the last thing, which is that regarding like the difficulty of knowing what ultimately is good, like across all time, or as they're saying in this last this conclusion here, like they still haven't figured out what virtue is. So if you can't figure out what virtue itself is, then how can you know whether it can be taught or not? So that there's difficulties about knowing these things. I don't know. I feel like they might be permanent in a way. I don't know. But I think if you have this view though, then what would be best for us is to always be, I guess, open. Like what is best for us is not any particular doctrine that tells us, this is what is the right thing to do for all time and all contexts from thousands of years ago to now or across different cultures. Of course, there's going to be variation, right? In different contexts. I think even Steve mentioned like the Inuit or something in previous, like, when the climate and the weather is very different so of course it's going to be different in different contexts. I actually think this is a thing that Plato wants to attune us to, that it's not any particular doctrine or any definition of the virtues that ultimately is the good thing. We have to be open to the possibility that the good might manifest itself in unique and special and surprising ways. And I feel like the dialogues actually do this. Like they always show like a very conventional view of what people think the good or a virtue is. Like temperance is walking slowly and appearing in a certain way. And, usually it's very aristocratic, but it might not be, of course. That virtue totally blows up that definition or those perceptions, those conventions. Yeah. So what is ultimately important is not a doctrine about the good or a theory of how to live our lives, but just being openness to the good itself. This dialogue won't help us like understand what that entails, but I think it's also pointing to this. And of course, the aporia that this dialogue ends up on, like almost all the other dialogues, like just emphasizes that point, right? Like it's getting us to be open to the question and not like, oh, I've read this book, I know exactly what virtue is now, and I just have to follow the directions and I will be a good person. No, that's almost like anti-philosophical for Plato. So I know that, for instance, Steve, in previous conversations on this dialogue, he was like, what did this dialogue teach us? What does this dialogue tell us? Like, I'm not getting anything from this. It's just raising all these problems and questions. But I think that's precisely, I think, what Plato's purpose is to raise the problems and the questions. And he's not just doing arbitrarily either. Oh, this is a fun thing to do. Like, it ties in with this view of the good and what is ultimately good and what's ultimately important for us.
Interesting. And what you said reminds me of the Statesman, when it said that we shouldn't get too attached to a particular constitution. When constitutions become inflexible, and we think that a particular constitution, maybe in the context of virtue, a particular constitution is virtuous, we cling to that, and we should be changing things as we learn more, is I think what was the conclusion I read from the Statesman. And it kind of just tied into what you said, whether virtue has a limit in time, I think is kind of the question that you brought up. And certainly I think what you said about virtue manifesting itself differently at different times, I think is interesting. And also interesting that you related what Socrates is saying to what he was eventually executed for, which was corrupting the virtue of the youth. And the people who condemned Socrates felt, I guess, that they knew what virtue was, and they felt that they knew that Socrates had corrupted that virtue, and Socrates paid for that with his life. And it was something he was willing to pay for. So maybe he was more virtuous than those who judged him less virtuous. So interesting connection there. Maybe that's really a big part of the background to this. So thanks for that, Steve.
Put in some last 2 cents for the sophist. Just that again, from the image that we have when you think of sophists, even if in this dialogue, there might be some praise for them, it's not, it's a negative view. So from the view that we've gotten, most likely from Plato's, being so prominent, is that the sophists are negative, is a negative view. But I think also that what they were proposing was more of a relativistic and experimental view. So I think their teachings and what they were proposing might be considered, if we looked at it in an open-handed way, long term, and not just this dialogue, but just keeping in mind that what they did propose is something that might be more adaptable toward the society that we have in the way of scientific inquiry and experimentalism and reason. So that was it. Thank you for a great podcast.
Well, thank you. And that's actually a really good point to end on, because we are actually out of time, unfortunately, but it's been a great discussion. I just thought I would read maybe this one section, because I think it relates very much to what you said and to what Darren said that we didn't get to, which is that part between 356A and 357A. And I'll just read this one paragraph and then we'll wrap it up, because I think it talks about the need to measure. And that may relate to what you just said, Steve, about kind of our modern approach of measuring things and our scientific ability now to measure things. Not that virtue is something that's scientific, or knowledge is something that's not necessarily scientific itself, and it's used to make scientific measurements. But so maybe there is a role for sophists here. Maybe we need to be knowledgeable consumers, and maybe that's part of this whole the whole purpose of this dialogue. So I'll just read this point about measurement, because I think it's interesting, and it relates to this weighting of probabilities. So Socrates says, "Since this is so, I will say to them, answer me this: do things of the same size appear to you larger when seen near at hand and smaller when seen from a distance, or not?" They would say they do. And similarly for thickness and pluralities, and equal sounds seem larger when near at hand, softer when farther away, they would agree. If then our well-being depended upon this, doing and choosing large things, avoiding and not doing the small ones, what would we see as our salvation in life? Would it be the art of measurement, or the power of appearance? And there's that word that Darren brought in near the beginning, the power of appearance. While the power of appearance often makes us wander all over the place in confusion, often changing our minds about the same things and regretting our actions and choices with respect to things large and small, the art of measurement, in contrast, would make the appearances lose their power by showing us the truth, would give us peace of mind firmly rooted in the truth, and would save our life. Therefore, would these men agree with this in mind, that the art of measurement would save us, or some other art? I agree, the art of measurement would. What if our salvation in life depended on our choices of odd and even, when the greater and the lesser had to be counted correctly, either the same kind against itself or one kind against the other, whether it be near or remote? What then would save our life? Surely nothing other than knowledge, specifically some kind of measurement, since that is the art of the greater and the lesser. In fact, nothing other than arithmetic, since it's a question of the odd and the even. Would these men agree with us or not? Protagoras thought they would agree. So I'll just end with that discussion about measurement, because measurement is something that comes up throughout Plato's dialogues. And here he brings it into play again. And again, that seemingly curious reference to the odd and even, but he gives a really interesting clue to the odd and even there and why he keeps bringing it up. He says, when the greater and the lesser had to be counted correctly, either the same kind against itself, which I read as the even, or one kind against the other, which I read as the odd. So that's a really interesting reference there, and that's something that I would like to explore at one point. So at the end conclusion of all of this, we don't have a definition of virtue, but I think that whether virtue is a form, which is a question that Adam, I think, may have asked, maybe it was in our first episode on the Protagoras, I would conclude, I don't think Socrates thinks it's a form, and I'm not sure that Protagoras has demonstrated that it's a form. So I think it seems to be, maybe from our discussion, if we can make one conclusion, whatever it is, it's based on knowledge. So I think that's probably a fair conclusion about it. And, we can see how that plays out in maybe our next episode, when I thought we would look at our next episode at the lesser Hippias, or Hippias minor, as it's sometimes called, Hippias being one of the sophists in attendance here. And that's a short dialogue. And maybe we can get some more ideas about the sophist approach to things by looking at that dialogue, the lesser Hippias or Hippias minor, in our next episode. And we'll be able to do that one in one episode. It's short enough that we can do it in one episode, but maybe some of what we've learned here, we can take to that. So, Darren, any closing words?
Oh, I just wanted to respond to, excuse me, what Steve said. I'll try to do it quickly. So he says that the sophists take a more relativistic view about the good, or I guess, like, maybe, I don't know if they would even want to use that word, like to our ways of life and what might be good for us. Steve was saying how that would be that might be more relevant to our day and time. I don't know if that actually contradicts what I was saying that Plato wants to get to, though. Like, Plato doesn't present us with a doctrine of virtue that if you follow, you will be a good person. Like, I think that's actually anti-philosophical and almost anti-virtuous for Plato, that to follow a doctrine like that, like so rotely. So, like, I don't think Steve was contradicting what I was saying, that we have to be open to new possibilities and what might be good in different situations, and how the good often manifests itself in surprising ways. For instance, like Socrates, how Socrates exhibits what a courage in the intellectual or philosophical life or doing philosophy looks like. But I think where the difference might be, though, is that Plato would say, though, that in all these different situations, like, how do you know something actually really is good? So Steve says, like, in different situations, a relativistic view might be better, but, like, how do you know in that specific situation or context that is actually the good thing? And I think that's what Plato's attuning us to. Like, to become attuned to that is to be able to recognize and also do the good thing in different situations. But that's the most important thing. It's not like a full-blown theory of, like, every specific, emotion or whatever you have to do in one time. That's impossible to capture, as Socrates was trying to, I think, demonstrate with his very universal view of calculation, where everything across all time is put on the same scale. So anyway, yeah, I just want to say that I don't know, like, I don't know what Steve says strongly contradicts what I was trying to say, but I think there is a difference in that Plato still thinks in each of those situations, you still have to know what the good is in order to distinguish, in order to be able to say something is good, even in a specific context, even if it differs from a different context.
Yeah, I mean, I read the relativistic point of Steve maybe a little bit differently, and I think it may relate somehow to this idea of weighting. That weighting, when you weight things, you're always doing a relativistic measure, as Socrates says. You're weighting greater against smaller, more against less, and so somehow we have to learn how to do that weighting. And whether it's the sophists that teach us or some other method of learning, I guess we need to learn to do that weighting. And I guess we won't find out this episode how to do that. We may never find out how to do that, but maybe we'll see some signs in the lesser hippias or hippias minor, how that weighting works or doesn't work. So we'll have a chance to explore that thought, I think, a little bit further. Eva, your ideas?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for starting this rough conversation. And James, thank you for leaving it open-ended. I think maybe that's the main thing about virtue or human beings. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and that's a very good way to end, on an open-ended way. So I appreciate that, Eva. So I wanted to thank everybody again for being here and for being part of this 3-part discussion on the Protagoras. I think it's been such an interesting discussion and on a dialogue that I found tricky, very tricky, but maybe that's deliberate on Plato's part, because sophistry could be tricky, or at least a young person's understanding of a sophist could be tricky. And maybe that's why he brings Hippocrates into it right at the beginning. And so maybe we're equipped to deal with sophistry. Maybe Socrates is equipped to deal with it, but is everybody equipped to deal with it? So we'll see how maybe we can find some means of weighting our knowledge over time. And maybe that's something that Socrates would encourage us to do, is use this art of measurement, whatever that is, to find the proper weightings of probabilities over time. And that's maybe our path to the good. We'll never reach the good, but it's our path to the good. And that's a good path to be on. So thanks for all for attending. Look forward to hopefully seeing you in 2 weeks for the lesser hippias or hippias minor. Looking forward to that discussion. And thanks again for a great discussion today. I'll end the recording now and invite anybody who wants to stay online for a casual half-hour unrecorded discussion in Plato's Cafe. You're more than welcome to. And otherwise, hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.